Hello, psycho-religion students. In this short video, I'm going to talk briefly about some major persons who helped influence the field of psychology of religion. And then I have four primary presuppositions I'd like to have as we're beginning our classwork and thinking in this field. So first of all, several names. That's all we're going to mention here at the start. We start with Stanley Hall. Stanley Hall from Clark University, often considered the first person to do studies in the field of psychology and religion. He mostly looked at adolescence as the key time for their religious growth, when we in fact know it's mostly children, that the vast majority of Christians anyway, about 2/3 of them, become Christians before they reach pubescence. But he got it started. Then you have William James, who is the father of American psychology, at least he's often called that. And William James' pivotal book around the turn of the 20th century was called Varieties of Religious Experience. Fascinating studies that he did in that field. He did a lot of surveys, a lot of studies of religious phenomena, unusual religious phenomena that people practiced, including here in the United States, even in Kentucky with some of the revivals 200 years ago, and the odd responses people would have to their faith. But particularly he was significant in religious surveying. And let's just give an example how it's still apropos today. Here we are during an election year coming up, and if you wanted to have an idea of who someone was voting for, and this shows how important religion is, someone comes out of a poll booth, and if you simply ask that person these two simple shared questions: is religion important to you, and do you regularly attend a house of worship? If the answer is yes, the great majority of time, over 80% of the time, the person will be Republican. And if the person answers no, the vast majority of the time, they are a Democrat. That doesn't mean, of course, there aren't Democrats who have deep Christian faith, or that Republicans who have little or no faith. But that gives you a clue into the significance of the religious outlook, and James helped us in that study. Then you have C.G. Jung, Jung, one of Freud's disciples, has his first book that was called Psychology of Religion, 1938. I actually have that book, where he was making a systematized field, and he was trying to primarily not look at creeds, but look at the experiences that people had that end up leading to those creedal beliefs in religion. And then finally we'll mention Gordon Allport, Allport, who studied the individual and his religion. That was his area. He even wrote a book with that same title. And he was intrigued with how persons are impacted by religion and how it gives them power. There is a great movie that's among your movie choices to watch for the class called Chariots of Fire. It swept the Oscars about 40 years ago. True story of two Olympic runners around 1920, one who was Jewish and one who was Christian, and the significance of their faith and how it actually gave them the fuel to become the persons that they were, the wonderful athletes. And that would be Gordon Allport's type of study, how an individual is impacted by religion. So those are the key names I'd like you to mention. There's some others they're not unimportant. I'll just mention James Leuba, Leuba. He's mentioned in your textbook. I think of his significance as probably adding religious bias, scientific bias to religion. He had a bias against religion and felt you could purely study supernatural things naturally. And it doesn't work very well. You can and should some as a social scientist, but his initial writings led to a bias that still exists today to a degree against religion in the psychology field. So those are the persons. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about some basic concepts that we'll be following in this class. And there's four of them, and here's the first one. And that is that people have the potential to be either rational or irrational. Rational or irrational. What does it mean to be rational? We know that people can be their best selves, be self-preserving, can learn from their mistakes, to be creative, to make the best of opportunities, to take care of themselves. These are all great character attributes and lead us towards health and wholeness, and the good life. We also know, though, that every one of us is just a little bit of irrational. And that little bit of irrationality can be like a drop of arsenic in your Coke, depending what you're irrational about. It could be that you're self-destructive, or you're selfish, or on occasion you avoid thinking things through. Or here's one that's probably common to all of us. We procrastinate. I mean, does that really make sense to procrastinate? It's irrational, but we do it. Or to not grow or to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. In my own experience, the place I often find people most irrational has to do with love relationships. And if you particularly look at Americans and their being the most marrying and dating and divorcing group of people on planet Earth, I have hundreds of times dealt with persons in marital counseling where they were simply irrational about a marriage relationship, a love relationship, when in fact they were quite rational human beings in almost every other area. So we'll mention that first of all. It's an ability, it's a choice. All of us are very, very rational beings. That's why we're here. But there's a little bit of irrationality in each of us. Secondly, the second proposition or concept that we'll mention is that this tendency towards irrationality is supported in the culture. It's supported by movies we watch, by the sports that we see. I'd seen an article about the woman journalist had written about how men's irrationality and violence is a result of watching sports. And she was particularly picking on football. And common, you go to a football game and there you see people punching each other, slamming each other down, screaming at each other. And that's just in the grandstands. It's brutal on the field. You kind of get the idea. I don't know if she's accurate at all, but we do know what is true is that these kinds of irrational behaviors are learned watching the normal fare of American television, particularly propensities to violence, which are just so destructive. Then a third concept has 4 steps to it, and let's just write them down in order, that human beings perceive, think, emote, and behave simultaneously. They perceive, think, emote, and behave simultaneously. Now that means all at the same time, of course, but it actually happens just like this. It all happens at the same time, but there's an order to it. Let's illustrate. I had a friend years ago from eastern Kentucky mountains. He was out driving in the great Southwest, and of course it's just flat as a pancake out there, and he's driving at night. He's got a friend sleeping in the front seat of the car, and suddenly, kind of like a scene from Indiana Jones, he sees a giant boulder coming right at him in his headlights, and he just has time to swerve off the road into the desert, knocking down cacti, and it woke up his friend, and he asked, why did you do this? And his friend said, well, I saw a big boulder coming right at me. And they got out of the car, and in the moonlight they could see flat land as far as you could see. And his friend said, you dummy, that wasn't a boulder. What did he see coming at him in his lights? It was a big tumbleweed, a big tumbleweed. But the important thing was he perceived it as a boulder, which led to him thinking, what am I going to do? He had emotion of great fear and then drove off the road. The key had to do with the perception and how he thought about it. See, there's lots of persons looking at our culture right now and what are we going to do to help people, particularly kids, things like that, develop healthy human beings. And so they focus on behavior. That's fine, but that's more like an antecedent. It's like the end of a train following along, the caboose. Some people think, let's focus on emotions. Let's people feel better about themselves. Build up their self-esteem. Have them repeat, I am somebody, over and over again. And that helps too, but it's not getting to the root cause. The root cause has to do with people's perception and their thinking, and that's where we focus on. So it has an order to it, but it really happens just in a millisecond. And then the last concept we will mention of the 4 is that the great majority of emotional problems and difficulties that people have then come from wrong thinking, wrong perceptions, disturbed thinking patterns. that can actually be eliminated or minimized, and then it helps persons with their emotions and with their behavior. Naturally, there are exceptions to all rules. Probably the biggest one that's very hard for counselors to make a differentiation has to do with chemical imbalances. And I've had my times where I struggled with it. I've been wrong. I've just been wrong on occasion. And some persons, simply because of the chemical makeup of their brain, aren't able to think as clearly as they wish. All courts, of course, many various exceptions. So we'll just say that, except the majority of time, people will think themselves into illness. And again, we don't fault them. Sometimes it's the sheer amount of trauma, lack of support system, learned irrationality from others in their household or that they're close to. And then finally, this is not one of the four basic concepts, but it's like a large umbrella one that we will come back to time and time again. In fact, we will cover this on class coming Monday night. And it is this: what people think determines what people feel. What people think determines what people feel. We tend to believe that the emotions are just out there, you can't control them, and all emotions are a direct result of something you are thinking the vast majority of time. So once again, if you want to help persons with emotional problems, you go back to the root source, which is thinking. So there we go. That's our first video that we'll be watching. We'll be coming together on Monday night. We will talk about something called the duplication theorem at the start. It's a follow-up on birth order, and I'll be passing out a chart that, based on a very large sample of 6,000 couples over about a 30-year period, at least one German theologian, not theologian, well, he's sort of a theologian and a psychologist because he's in this field, Walter Thoman, who believes that based on that, he can pretty well peg who your likely or best marriage partner would be. Big promises. We'll pass out a chart then. I'll see you in class. Bye.